I'm Dom. I'm just over a year into my PhD at the IT University of Copenhagen. And my main topic is on myth in games as a framework for understanding how games make meaning. And so what this talk represents is my current thinking on myth making as an ongoing process and one that's negotiated between a community of players and the developer. So the context for that discussion is an example of a game with what I think is a pretty unique and interesting development history and design philosophy, old school RuneScape. So I'll flick between these two screenshots, which kind of give you an idea of the differences. They show me on the exact same square of the game world in old school RuneScape and in the current RuneScape 3, which is the main game. And old school RuneScape was one of the first of what has become a trend of long-standing MMOs to release a classic version. And the success of old school can maybe be credited with giving Blizzard a precedent, which prompted them to come out with World of Warcraft Classic, which I'm sure most of you have heard of. So here's a graph with the average number of active players in both old school and RuneScape 3. Blue is old school and yellow is RuneScape 3. So we can see that the average number of active players was kind of around the same at the beginning, but then old school drops off pretty quickly, which might confirm the hypothesis that it was a quick nostalgia hit, like a fun trip down memory lane, but nothing really sustainable in the long term. But this changes in 2015 when the numbers start to rise, and then from 2016 onwards, old school really starts to pull away from RuneScape 3. And this big spike here is where the mobile version comes out. And so I want to talk about two things here, really. So more specifically, I'm interested in the story of old school and how it came to be, how it became a success, its peculiar design philosophy as well, which I'll get to. And more broadly, I'm interested in what this tells us about nostalgia and what happens when we finally get access to a lost time, in a sense. So let's start with a quick history of RuneScape for some context. It begins here in Cambridge back in 1999 as a very short-lived multi-user dungeon by Andrew Gower. For the next couple of years, Andrew teams up with his brother Paul, and together they released RuneScape in 2001. And then the two brothers formed Jagex to run the MMO from there. And then from here on out, the numbers in front of RuneScape, so 2 and 3 here, don't refer to new games, as I've kind of suggested, but they are kind of semi-officially applied to certain major updates, like a big overhaul of the engine. And this becomes important because it entails a loss of access to the previous game world. So in 2004, we get RuneScape 2, which has a big engine overhaul that allows fully 3D graphics. But not everyone was happy in the run-up to this change, and Jagex actually also kept the original RuneScape running on as RuneScape Classic, which ran until just a couple of years ago when its servers were finally shut down. And this is in some sense then the first instance of what I'm talking about with these classic versions of MMOs. But the difference here is that Classic was a continuation and a static continuation of the original game, whereas old school is going back to a version of the game we genuinely lost access to. And RuneScape 2, this period here is where where the game sees real widespread success. And if there are, as there often are in MMOs, there are often discussions on when the golden age of RuneScape is, and it's usually sometime in this period that people name. So this kind of riot of many names, the pay-to-PK riot, the World 66 riot, is one of many in-game protests that were held in RuneScape. It's just a way of them to make their voices heard to the developer. And this particular one exemplifies the unrest in the player base towards the latter half of RuneScape 2's life. So fighting the issue of real-world trading, exchanging real money for in-game items, Jagex implement tighter controls on player-to-player trade. They remove player killing from a chaotic area called the Wilderness. And for many players, these changes represented a loss of the soul of RuneScape, moving the game away from the things that people felt differentiated this MMO from others. And though these protests lasted about a week straight and seemed to actually have a pretty significant impact on the game afterwards, so the number of paying memberships fell quite dramatically and never really recovered. And the discussion and anger directed at Jagex didn't really subside. These updates were actually eventually reversed in 2011 following a referendum of the players, but that seems to have been too late to reverse the damage. The early 2010s also saw an increasing use of microtransactions in RuneScape, which further displeased players. And in fact, by 2018, microtransactions made up nearly a third of Jagex's total revenue, according to their annual report. Then in 2013, we get this update here called the Evolution of Combat, marking the era of RuneScape 3. This changes the game from its iconic but very, very dated tick-based combat system to one that more resembles World of Warcraft and other sort of standardized MMOs. And for many, this kind of was the final straw. So then we had a bunch of discussions around this period with a desire to go back to the good old days. And there were a bunch of unsanctioned private pre-update servers which gained in popularity while the player base of RuneScape proper continued to fall. So in February 2013, we get this blog post from Mark Gerhard, who was then the CEO of Jagex. He talks about the nostalgic and often passionate discussions that the players had, and says that they managed to dig up a full game backup taken by pure coincidence in August 2007. And the announcement here was for a vote to be held assessing the potential support for reopening this server. Now, by the end of the poll, about 450,000 people had shown their support for Old School, which was a little shy of the final 500,000 threshold. So depending on how many people voted, they would implement different things to do with the game. But you can see the ticks here are what Jagex decided to actually reopen the game doing. So this is the very quick story of how Old School came to be, more or less. But Old School was released in 2013, so it's now had about 7 years plus of development. And far from the basic level of maintenance promised, Old School has seen significant updates. And you can get a bit of a sense of that just by comparing this game world map from 2007 and the current game world map. So you can see a bunch of areas have been revamped or added to. We have a whole new continent over here. And then, of course, a ton of other updates that you can't really see in a map. So Old School is now vastly different from the current RuneScape 3. It's vastly different from the Old School of 2013, and it's vastly different from the 2007 backup on which it's based. So that kind of brings me to my central question of what is Old School about Old School. So as I said, my PhD project as a whole is about myth, and I've been thinking of ways to understand this very slippery concept. And for a long time, the understanding of myth that has been most useful to me has been a kind of semiotic understanding, exemplified by kind of Holland Butts and people like that. So myth not as an object or a type or a genre of story, something like that, but as a way in which things are expressed and meaning is made. And recently I've begun thinking a lot more about time in this process of myth making, because there's surely a significant difference between the sort of connections and associations and signs that are created now versus ones which have consistently been made in that way over a long period of time. So I've been thinking through these with two metaphors of ossification and fossilization. So ossification is the process of muscle tissue slowly hardening into bone. And so for this, I think we can think of signs with these arbitrary connections which have over time accrued kind of a stability and a solidity in their place within culture. So think of the sign of the Christian cross, for instance, which is now, of course, a very, very, very rigid and established sign. And so in that process, it becomes like bone. And then over the bone, these newer, more malleable and fluid signs are added. And that is the flesh in this metaphor. So fossilization would then be when a sign system like that is like cut off from our living sign systems. So we can interpret ancient literature, and you can still figure out what that sign system as a snapshot was, the fossil, but it's now disconnected from our current society. That's broadly what I'm working with here. And so this goes back to the point about new eras of RuneScape not being sequels that you can return to like an old Call of Duty game, but they overwrite the previous version. So each previous version becomes a lost object, like a fossil sign system. And I think that's what's interesting about this story of Old School here then, because it is kind of a fossil resurrected. It was by pure coincidence that they had a backup. It wasn't known about or planned. So we had a genuinely lost time which we then have access to again. And so maybe this can start us off on an answer of what's old school about old school. In reaccessing this fossilized sign system, we have to actively attempt to recover not only the important static signs, the snapshot of the game as it was then, but we also have to try and rediscover the mode in which that sign system developed, the dynamicity and fluidity of it. And this entails accessing a sort of retro future. So RuneScape 2 at the time wasn't a static game, of course, it updated and changed all the time. They could have released the backup as an unchanging snapshot, like a playable museum exhibit or something archival, but that's not the route they went down. And so to go down this route, we need two sets of ingredients. Like I say, we need this beginning fossil, this static signs, this, the game as it was then, the snapshot. But secondly, we then need to establish the principles by which they came into being and to then project that forward. So we need to create new updates, new quest lines, new weapons, and all that kind of stuff, while adhering to this spirit somehow. Which then brings me back to Maria Garda, who we've heard from in this conference, who takes from Svetlana Boym this very useful distinction of restorative and reflective nostalgia. So yeah, restorative nostalgia is this direct attempt to recreate or resurrect the object of nostalgia, like emulators and restoring old machines. Reflective nostalgia, on the other hand, being more about using the object of nostalgia as like a guide to create new things. It's about tapping into a feeling, a spirit, conventions of the period. I'm sure she can correct me if I've misunderstood that. But and so what's interesting about old school for me there is that it's very much a conflation of the two. You have this restorative aspect of bringing back literally the backup of the game, but then we try to update it further, which requires this very reflective mode of nostalgia. And this is negotiated by the community. But in the conflation of these two, I think we need to wonder about what it is we're trying to recreate or bring back. Exactly what spirit are we trying to bring back? Because we're not just trying to have this backup out there for archival or historical purposes, because those methods put it back those methods of putting the 2007 backup out there leave the fossil, as it were. They just make it more accessible. But what we're trying to do here is revivify it by combining these modes of nostalgic thinking. And so what this seems to lead to then is a very open discussion within the community on exactly what old schoolness is. And I think here it might be useful to go back to ideas like Espinoz's notion of the implied game object. So he says that an implied game object does not exist, but is imagined by the player as what the game is or ought to be. A game riddled with software bugs is perceived as merely the flawed actual version of an uncompleted implied game. We conceptualize the real game as being without the annoying bugs and the present version as an unwanted stand-in for the real implied thing. And what interests me here is, again, this idea of the temporal and process-oriented nature of it. So we are always in the process of creating the implied game object or the ideal game object. And old school, it seems, is just a more explicit instance of this, and crucially one that is being done within a community of players and between that community and the developers, all in a game that has to change pretty often. So it's a continual process of constructing and negotiating an ideal game object, based both on restorative and reflective modes of nostalgia, i.e., based both on the actual existing fossil of RuneScape and incorporating that into a new process of ossification, of active myth making. Sounds pretty tough. So how are these updates managed? Every update in old school RuneScape is voted on by players. Jagex presents the updates in dev blogs, weekly Q&A live streams, and things like that. And then when those updates are solidified and maybe even already worked on, players can go to an in-game polling booth and vote yes, no, or skip on each element of the proposed update. Only propositions with a supermajority of 75% yes votes are implemented. And that's quite a high threshold, and these polls are quite meaningful, maybe surprisingly so. So at one point, Jagex had put many, many months of work into a new skill called sailing. They had dev blogs, they had a trailer even for it. The skill polled 68% yes and 32% no. So a huge majority, but this was back in 2015. It was scrapped, and hasn't been heard of since. So they have significant consequences for the development process. Now, true to tradition, in-game riots or protests are also then a way for players to express their dissatisfaction with the direction of the game. One memorable but frankly quite awful example of this was in the summer of 2017, when Jagex added a temporary event celebrating Pride. Now, RuneScape has a long-standing history of holiday events. They're usually short, fun, unserious events themed around Easter, Halloween, Christmas, and things like that. And in old school, they're not usually put to a vote, the idea being they're just a bit of fun and they don't affect any other part of the game. But when Jagex decided for the first time to do one such event celebrating Pride, a rather furious discussion broke out. The main rallying cry was that, I'm going to be using air quotes a lot here, was that unlike Christmas or Halloween, a Pride event is political, and that an essential part of RuneScape is that it is an escape from real-world politics. This spread to in-game protests pretty quickly. So there's usually in RuneScape protests, you have slogans like "We pay, we say." That's a very common one. In this, it turned into "We pay, no gay." So yeah, and even more sickeningly, protests like this one at the time always seemed to end with a bunch of players dressing in all white robes and chanting KKK lines. So I just want to bring up this example to say that this process of myth making is also fraught with tension. I don't want to romanticize it as some harmonious community building solution. It's a very messy process, and by its nature can become exclusionary, conservative, and reactionary. So in the interest of time, let's bring this together. In old school, I think we see a rare case of a community being nostalgic for a lost time and object, explicitly so, but then actually getting access to it again. Now, in order to keep it alive, the community surrounding that object has to then constantly debate what old schoolness is. So what is old school about old school? There's a few answers that I could give here. I could, like in the web diagram earlier, just list a bunch of things that seem to be important to players, like art style and music and stuff. But that's always going to feel incomplete and not really respectful of the fact that everyone's attachment to the game is different, comes from a different place, and some players never even played the original nostalgic object, let's say. I could also more cynically say that there is nothing old school about old school, and it just trades off a retro feeling, exploiting the nostalgia of players. But I think where I lean most towards in looking into this more deeply is a focus on that process of myth making, that always building of it. So what's old school about old school is tautologically the fact that the developers and player base are constantly striving for it explicitly, arguing for their personal sense of what makes the game meaningful. In other words, it's a game where its sense of identity and the player's relation to the object of nostalgia is itself the myth that must be constantly and cooperatively constructed as a way of players relating to the game and forming the community. So thank you. Yeah, that's where I'm at with this topic at the moment. I'd love to hear thoughts on it.
Thank you very much, Dom.